They say a mother's love is unconditional. But what kind of mother sells her own daughter for a sack of oats and a broken mule? In a town where beauty was currency, Nella was considered worthless, too ugly to marry, too soft to survive. So when her mother gave her away to a feared mountain man, folks whispered it was a mercy. But what they didn't see coming was the bond that would form between the broken and the cast off. Why did this silent recluse risk everything for her? And what did he see in the girl no one else could love? When a mother's cruelty meets a stranger's unexpected kindness, one question lingers: who truly saves who? And what if the ones we cast aside are the ones who heal us? Every time I read your comments, I'm reminded that stories like these bring us closer. Across states, struggles, and generations, if you still believe in the power of redemption, quiet strength, and second chances, then you belong here with us. Let me know which state you're watching from, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share so we can keep telling stories that matter. They said Nella was born with the wrong face. Too much nose, not enough chin. One eye, smaller than the other, and her skin pale like unbaked dough. Blotched and tired before she'd even learned to walk. God cursed her straight from the womb, her mother used to say, loud enough for others to hear. The neighbors would nod, sometimes in sympathy, more often in judgment. No father had ever claimed her. No child ever asked her to play. She learned early to walk quietly, to lower her gaze, to make herself small, though no smallness could ever satisfy the woman who bore her. The morning her mother sold her, the wind was dry and sharp, rustling through the brittle corn stalks that had long since given up the fight for harvest. The townsfolk gathered near the livery, pretending not to watch but unable to look away. Nella stood barefoot in the dust, her thin arms wrapped around herself, eyes fixed on the ground. Her mother, Hester, wore her Sunday dress, though it was a Wednesday, rouge on her cheeks and a ribbon in her thinning hair. She laughed too loudly as she haggled, not for the price of a mule, but for the price of her daughter's worth. The man she bargained with stood a full head taller than any other, his beard tangled like briarwood, eyes hidden beneath a wide, weathered hat. Elias was what they called him, though no one in town had heard him speak. He came down from the mountains twice a year, once for salt, once for seed, and when he did, children were ushered inside and whispers curled like smoke from the church steps. "She's no good for housework," Hester said, jerking Nella forward by the elbow. "But maybe you're just lonely." "She don't talk much. That ought to suit you fine." Elias didn't flinch. He tossed a thick hemp rope to the stable hand who led a limping mule forward. A burlap sack thudded against the wooden stoop beside it. Oats. The trade was made. No words spoken, no blessing given. "Come on, girl," Hester hissed, pushing Nella toward him as if discarding trash. Nella stumbled, caught herself, and stood still as stone. She dared a glance upward, and for a split second her eyes met his. They were not cruel, nor kind, just still, like winter before snow. He turned without a word and began on a walk. Nella looked back once. Her mother was already checking the mule's teeth, counting her gain. No wave goodbye, no last look. The girl followed the mountain man, up past the outskirts of town, past the last cottage and the rusted sign that read, "No trespass beyond." The road turned to gravel and then to mud. Nella's shoes were threadbare and water seeped in, but she did not complain. The silence between them grew heavy with her thoughts. Was she property now? A servant? Bait for some darker fate? But Elias never touched her, never told her to hurry. When she stumbled, he waited. The mountains loomed ahead, blue-gray and endless. Somewhere in those trees, a new life waited, though Nella couldn't yet tell if it would be worse than the one she'd left behind. Still, for the first time in her memory, no one was calling her ugly, and somehow that silence hurt the least. The path twisted upward until the trees swallowed the sky. Pines rose like pillars in a forested cathedral, their tops whispering secrets Nella could never hear. Her legs ached, her stomach clenched with hunger, and every breath stung her throat from the climb. But she said nothing. She had learned long ago that silence was safer. Questions earned slaps. Complaints earned worse. Elias walked ahead, steady and sure, the rope from the mule coiled over one shoulder. He never turned to look at her, never offered a hand when she slipped, but somehow he always paused at the right moments. When the climb steepened, when she faltered, his silence was a wall, but it didn't have spikes. By the time the cabin came into view, dusk had already bled into the trees. It was smaller than she'd imagined, a single-room shack nestled into the curve of the hillside, half swallowed by ivy and moss. Smoke curled from the chimney like a sleepy ribbon, and the windows glowed a soft amber from the fire inside. It looked like a place out of one of her drawings, if she still had them. He opened the door with a creak and stepped aside, letting her enter first. Nella hovered on the threshold, heart pounding. She half expected chains on the walls or a cot of straw in the corner. But there were no cages here, just the smell of wood smoke and thyme, a rough-hewn table with 2 stools, a hearth stacked with fresh logs, and a cast-iron pot bubbling gently. Her stomach growled before she could stop it. Elias moved past her without a word. He stirred the pot, ladled something thick and steaming into a wooden bowl, and placed it on the table. Then another. He sat across from her, picked up his spoon, and ate without looking up. Nella stood frozen. She hadn't been served food since she was old enough to fetch her own. Her hands trembled as she sat. The stew was plain. Root vegetables, wild herbs, and something like venison. But to her, it tasted like mercy. She ate in quick, careful bites, afraid it would be taken away. When the bowl was clean, Elias stood and pointed to the bed, a modest frame in the far corner covered in a woolen quilt patched with age. Then he laid out a blanket near the hearth for himself. Her breath caught. He was giving her the bed. She didn't understand it. Men like him, loners, rough and hard and half feral, were supposed to hurt girls like her. At least, that's what her mother always warned. But Elias never looked at her with hunger or disgust. He barely looked at her at all. He grunted once before blowing out the lantern. The fire crackled low, casting shadows across the timber walls. Nella lay in the bed, stiff with confusion. She listened to his slow, steady breathing. No threats, no hands grabbing in the dark, just quiet. And in that quiet, something unfamiliar began to stir. Not fear, not safety exactly, but something softer. A question, a hope, so fragile she didn't dare name it. Maybe, just maybe, she had not been sold to a beast. The days crawled by like wounded animals, slow and uncertain. The mountains woke each morning with a hush, the fog curling low around the trees, muffling the world in gray. Inside the cabin, the silence was heavier still. Nella moved through it like a ghost, unsure if she belonged or if she was merely waiting for the moment. Elias remembered she had no use. He barely spoke, not out of cruelty, she was beginning to realize, but because silence seemed to be his native tongue. He rose before dawn, disappeared into the woods, and returned with firewood, wild herbs, sometimes fresh meat slung over his shoulder. He would nod once when their eyes met, not out of greeting, but acknowledgement, like one might do for a stray dog that had chosen not to run off. Nella cleaned the cabin each morning, though it was never truly dirty. She scrubbed the floor, wiped the soot from the hearth, even washed his shirt one day. When he left it drying by the fire, he didn't thank her, he didn't stop her. But when she returned from gathering pine cones for kindling, she found a clean pair of wool socks folded at the foot of the bed. She hadn't brought it up, and neither had he. At night, she lay awake, staring at the wooden beams above her. Her body still flinched at every sudden sound, every shift of wind against the shutters. She half expected to be dragged outside, sold again, beaten for stepping out of place. That was how things had been. A girl like her didn't earn kindness. She was a burden, something to be tolerated until someone found a way to profit from her. The silence should have felt safe, but in the hollow of it, her fears echoed louder than ever. She'd always believed she was broken. Her mother had told her so often enough. No man wants a face like that. Your voice is like gravel in a boot. You've got nothing to offer but trouble. Words sharp enough to scar from the inside out. So now, even in this quiet place, with no fists raised and no insults flung, Nella shrank into herself, unsure how to exist without punishment. To fill the hours, she peeled bark from fallen limbs and carved small figures, tiny birds, a fox with a crooked tail, a one-eyed cat. She hid them beneath the bed, ashamed to be caught doing something so foolish. She cooked too, fumbling through the ingredients she didn't recognize. The meals were never more than simple stews or flatbread, but Elias always ate without complaint. Still, he never smiled. One afternoon, while sweeping the porch, Nella caught sight of him watching her through the window. Not staring, not glaring, just watching, like someone unsure of what to make of the creature that had landed in his world. She looked away quickly, face burning. What was she to him? A trade, a chore, a charity case, or just a shadow that wouldn't leave? She longed for a word, just one, something to mark the days, to pierce the fog. But Elias only gave her his silence and the slow, careful rhythm of his presence. It wasn't cruel, but it wasn't comfort either. Not yet. The rain came without warning, heavy and sudden, slicing through the trees like glass needles. One moment, the forest was still. The next, it roared with wind and water. Nella had wandered farther than usual, chasing dry kindling with a woven basket slung over her arm. The sky had been gray all morning, but she'd ignored it. The firewood was running low, and she wanted to be useful. Wanted him to see she wasn't just a burden. The basket slipped from her grasp as the rain poured down. She scrambled to gather the fallen sticks, but the mud swallowed them. Her fingers trembled from cold, her clothes soaked through in seconds. Water ran down her face, clinging to her lashes and lips, and she knelt there in the dirt, half frozen and choking on old memories. She heard footsteps before she saw him. A branch cracked and Elias emerged from between two trees, towering and still as a stone. He said nothing at first, just looked at her, mud on her face, arms scraped, shoulders hunched like she expected to be struck for the mistake. Her breath came in sharp, panicked gasps. She wanted to explain herself, to apologize for being clumsy, for getting lost, for being exactly what her mother had always said, useless. But he didn't shout, didn't scowl. Without a word, Elias shrugged off his heavy coat, the one that smelled of pine and wood smoke, and draped it over her shivering shoulders. It was far too big, swallowing her whole. She blinked up at him, stunned. Then, in that low, gravel-worn voice she'd barely heard since arriving, he said, just 3 words. "You're safe." Something cracked open inside her. Not because he said it, but because she believed him. The walk back was quiet, the storm softening as they reached the cabin. Elias didn't ask for thanks. He didn't demand anything. He simply lit the fire, handed her a dry cloth, and left her to warm by the hearth while he set her wet boots by the stove. His silence no longer felt like absence. It felt like space, room for her to be, to breathe. That night, long after he had laid down on his bedroll, Nella sat up in the dim firelight. The coat still clung to her like a second skin, heavy and comforting. Her fingers itched, not from cold, but from memory. She reached beneath the bed, where she had tucked away a bit of charred wood from the fireplace, and the back of an old flour sack. With hesitant strokes, she began to draw. A bird, crooked and uneven but alive on the page, then a fox, a clumsy attempt at a deer. The lines were childish, the proportions wrong, but it didn't matter. These shapes were hers. For the first time in her life, her hands made something that no one could take away, belittle, or trade. Elias stirred once, glanced toward her from his place by the fire. Their eyes met. He said nothing, but in his quiet gaze, Nella felt something rare bloom in the silence between them. Not pity, not duty, recognition. And under the soft flicker of firelight, Nella smiled. The days softened like worn leather. Without quite realizing when it began, Nella slipped into a rhythm that felt almost like life. She rose each morning before the sun crested the pines, toes curling against the cold wood floor, breath fogging in the crisp mountain air. She would light the stove, sweep the cabin floor, and step outside into the dewy quiet to feed the 2 goats Elias kept behind the house. Their names, if they had ever been given any, were unknown to her, but she called them Willow and Birch. They nuzzled her hands and chewed her braids, and somehow that silly affection warmed her more than any hearth. She gathered herbs from the shaded edges of the tree line, learning by instinct and careful observation what Elias used for stew and what he left alone. He never told her what to do. He didn't leave lists or bark orders, but each time she returned with wild garlic, yarrow, or thyme, he gave the faintest nod. Approval, quiet and real. It made her chest ache, and in a way she didn't fully understand. Every night, after supper, after the fire settled into glowing coals and Elias leaned against the hearth with his eyes half closed, Nella would reach under the loose floorboard beneath the bed and retrieve her sketching cloth. It wasn't proper paper, just torn bits of burlap and flour sacks, smoothed flat with stones, but it was hers. The charcoal stub was nearly worn to nothing, but she used it with care, dragging soft lines across the fabric to shape the creatures that filled her world. She drew the goats first, then a sparrow she saw perched near the roof, a pine marten, quick and golden-eyed, and sometimes she drew Elias, never full on, never boldly, just glimpses, the curve of his shoulder as he chopped wood, the way his hand rested gently on the neck of a goat, the heavy set of his brow in firelight. She wasn't sure why she drew him. Maybe because his stillness fascinated her. Maybe because in her own quiet way, she was trying to understand him. He noticed, of course. Not once did he ask what she was doing, but now and then she caught his eyes flick to the burlap in her lap. He said nothing, but he never stopped her. There were moments when it almost felt like laughter might live here if only someone spoke it aloud. One afternoon, as Nella tried to carry a bucket of water that was far too full, she slipped on the wet grass and fell flat on her back, soaked and sputtering. Elias was splitting logs nearby. For a moment, she thought he might scold her, or worse, ignore her. Instead, he looked over with that familiar, unreadable gaze and shook his head just once, almost amused. It was the closest thing to a smile she'd seen from him. She smiled more often now. Not wide or loud, but soft, private things that stayed on her lips even after the fire burned low. The cabin no longer felt like a place she was surviving. It felt like a place she could be. She didn't know what it meant yet, what would happen next, or if this strange, silent peace would last. But for now, she fed the goats, gathered herbs, drew the wild things of the mountain, and lived beside a man who asked for nothing and gave more than he knew. And that, for Nella, was more than she had ever hoped to find. The snow hadn't come yet, but the air had begun to whisper of it. The mornings were crisp enough to sting Nella's cheeks and turn her breath to mist as she walked the wooded edge beyond the cabin, gathering kindling and whispering to the world around her. It started without meaning to, soft little hums and phrases under her breath as she fed the goats or followed the flick of a bird's wing through the trees. "There you are," she'd murmur to the squirrel darting along a low branch, or "Don't be greedy," to the goat nudging her apron pocket for oats. The animals didn't speak back, but they lingered longer. The birds didn't fly off so quickly. The goats brayed when they saw her, and when she talked, nervously, aimlessly, it felt less like loneliness and more like being heard. Elias noticed. She could tell, even though he never said so. He'd glance up from chopping wood or mending a fishing line, his eyes resting on her just a second longer than needed. He never mocked her, never told her to hush. That, in itself, was its own kind of miracle. One evening, after a long day of hauling wood and baking a small, clumsy loaf of bread that came out too hard on the edges, Nella sat at the table with her charcoal stub and a fresh piece of sackcloth. The fire glowed warm and low, casting golden shapes across the walls. Elias sat by the hearth as he always did, polishing a knife slowly, methodically. His coat hung from a hook by the door, boots drying near the stove. She looked at him, really looked, and saw the lines that carved his face, deep and weary, but not cruel. The way his mouth rested, never tight with anger, just still. The way his eyes always watched, but never hunted. She began to sketch him. At first, she was careful, cautious, drawing only his broad shoulders, the line of his jaw, the way his hands curled over the knife hilt. But her lines grew bolder. She sketched the quiet strength in his posture, the softness in his silence. She gave him the expression he wore when he watched her feed the goats, the one that didn't smile, but wasn't far from it. When she finished, she didn't hide the drawing right away. She looked at it in the flickering light, heart pounding, and wondered if she should show him. She didn't. But she didn't hide it either. The next morning, her shoes, those thin splitting things held together with twine, were gone from beside the door. Panic flared for a moment, but when she turned, there they were. Newly stitched, soles patched with thick leather, the seams careful and clean. Her breath caught in her throat. She looked up and found Elias already by the fire, sipping from a tin mug, not meeting her gaze. "Thank you," she whispered, unsure if her voice would even reach him. He nodded once. Later that day, she spoke more. Not just to the birds or the goats, but to him. Small things. "Do you like thyme in the stew? Or it'll snow soon, won't it?" She babbled sometimes, filling the air with questions he didn't answer. But he listened, and somehow that was more comforting than any reply. Her shame, once a cloak she wore like skin, began to loosen. Not disappear, but loosen. Her voice trembled less. Her eyes met his more often. She started to believe that maybe she wasn't something to be hidden, that maybe here in this quiet cabin in the mountains, she was not a mistake. And when the birds came in the morning to perch by the window, chirping and flitting their tiny wings, she smiled and whispered, "He's not as scary as he looks." Then turned to see Elias watching her from the doorway. He said nothing, but his eyes were warm. The wind had turned restless that morning, moaning through the trees like an old ghost searching for something it had lost. Nella stayed inside, tending to the hearth and folding linens that barely needed folding. Elias had gone out to check the traps near the ridge, leaving her alone in the cabin. A rare thing now, and something that no longer filled her with fear but with curiosity. She moved gently through the room, her feet bare, mindful not to disturb the quiet rhythm they had grown into. It wasn't that she meant to snoop. She wasn't even looking for anything. But when she shifted the wooden stool beside the far wall to sweep beneath it, her broom caught the edge of a floorboard that sat just a little higher than the others. Underneath, a small trunk waited. It was nothing like her own hiding place where her sketches lay folded and fragile beneath the bed. This one was older, heavier, made of dark wood and iron hinges, its corners worn from years of use. A brass lock hung on the front, the kind that once kept private things private, but the latch had rusted through. With a quiet breath and trembling fingers, Nella lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in a faded wool blanket, were things untouched by time yet heavy with it: a child's bonnet, soft and sun-bleached, a woman's embroidered shawl, a small hand-carved toy horse, and beneath them all, a picture frame, cracked across the glass but holding fast to the faces inside. The woman had dark, curling hair and eyes like a deep forest. The child, no older than 4, beamed with a grin so full of life it almost hurt to see. And between them, Elias, though younger, unburdened, his arm wrapped protectively around the two. Nella's breath caught in her throat. She felt like an intruder, as though she'd walked in on something sacred. She didn't hear the door open behind her. Elias stood in the threshold, snow melting from his coat, his eyes fixed on the frame in her hands. For a moment, he didn't move. The air around him stilled, pulled taut like a bowstring. Nella opened her mouth to speak, to apologize, but no words came. The frame shook slightly in her grasp. He stepped forward, slow but sure, and gently took it from her fingers. His thumb brushed the crack in the glass, his face unreadable. "Don't go in the trunk again," he said softly. Not a threat, not even anger, just a statement heavy with years she couldn't see. She nodded, lowering her gaze. He didn't say anything more. He placed the frame back in the trunk, tucked the shawl over it like a blanket, and closed the lid. Then he walked to the hearth and stirred the fire as if nothing had happened, but something had. Nella felt it like a draft under the door. Something old and buried had been disturbed. A weight in the room had shifted. He hadn't yelled, he hadn't punished her, but the look in his eyes, silent, broken, full, stayed with her long after the fire had burned down to coals. That night, she didn't draw. She sat by the fire and watched it flicker, thinking of the little girl in the photo and the quiet man who had once smiled. And for the first time, she wondered what kind of grief could take the sound out of someone's life. The first snow fell quietly, blanketing the cabin roof and the pines beyond in a hush that seemed to swallow sound. Smoke curled upward into the gray sky, and inside the little home, the fire crackled low. Nella sat by it with her sketching cloth in her lap, but her hands were still. Her charcoal lay unused on the table beside her. Across the room, Elias was sharpening his knife with long, steady strokes, but even that familiar rhythm carried a weight tonight. The silence between them wasn't the usual kind. It pressed closer, thicker, as if waiting. Finally, he stopped, laid the blade down, and spoke. She was 4 years old. Called her Annabeth. Nella looked up, startled not by the sound of his voice, but by the shape of it. There was no hardness, no edge, just the tired tone of someone who hadn't said a name out loud in too many years. My wife, Rachel, was stitching a quilt that day. Annabeth was playing in the yard, chasing chickens. He stared into the fire like it might play the scene back for him. We lived in a little house near the river bend. Not much, but it was ours. I built it with my own hands. Nella didn't interrupt. She barely breathed. There was a mining company out that way, run by a man named Silas Grove. He wanted the mountain opened up for blasting. More rock, more money. They said they'd be careful, said they'd keep their distance, but greed makes men deaf. His voice lowered. That morning, there was a boom, louder than thunder, shook the ground like it was trying to wake the dead. I ran outside. The ridge behind the house had split open. Boulders came down like giants, stomping through the trees. One hit the chimney. The whole place caught fire. His hands tightened in his lap, knuckles pale beneath his weathered skin. I tried to get in, got the door open, couldn't see nothing. Smoke was too thick. Heard Annabeth scream once, just once. Then not again. The fire popped, a coal collapsing inward, but neither of them flinched. They buried what was left in the town graveyard. 2 stones, no names, just markers paid for by the midwife. I couldn't afford better. And Silas? Elias gave a bitter smile, almost a grimace. He paid a fine. Claimed it was an accident, said I'd built too close to the blasting zone. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling like he could see ghosts in the rafters. The townsfolk believed him. Said it was my fault. Said I was drunk that day, though I'd never touched a drop. Called me cursed, dangerous. One by one, doors closed. Friends stopped speaking. They blamed me. Said I let my family die. He looked at Nella then. Not through her. At her. So I left. Took what I could carry and came up here. Figured if the world was done with me, I'd be done with it. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of sorrow, of memory, of things long buried, finally given breath. Nella's eyes burned, but she didn't cry. She just sat with him in the quiet, her own wounds humming under her skin. She understood, in her own way, what it meant to be blamed, to be unwanted, to carry grief like a second heart. He didn't ask for comfort, and she didn't offer it, but when she stood to stir the stew on the fire, she made sure to add extra time. She knew he liked it that way, and when she handed him his bowl, their hands brushed. He didn't pull away. The crows came first, black smudges circling low over the hills outside town, their cries sharp and bitter. The townsfolk always said crows were omens, and this time they weren't wrong. By midday, the men rode in on horseback, dust rising behind them like smoke. Their coats were stiff with road dust, their boots polished in ways that didn't belong to mountain soil. They wore hats too clean and smiles too sharp. Strangers, but not the kind who passed through quiet. Silas Grove hadn't changed much. His beard was trimmed now, the gray in it carefully groomed, and his clothes bore the fine stitching of a man who'd climbed higher off the backs of others. He walked with the confidence of someone who had never been told no. At his side, a pair of younger men, hired hands or worse, kept pace, eyes scanning the streets like they were appraising livestock. They headed straight for the saloon, but word traveled faster than liquor in a place like this. By sundown, everyone knew. Silas Grove was back, and he was asking about Elias Mercer. Come to settle a debt, he'd said to the barkeep, his voice smooth as oil. Man's been up there long enough. Time someone called in what he owes. What exactly Elias owed, he didn't say, but the implication was clear. The preacher's wife told the baker told the blacksmith, and by the time midwife Ada heard, the whole town was buzzing like a disturbed hive. Silas claimed he had legal rights to the timber up in the North Ridge, a section of mountain untouched by axes or saws, land that had once belonged to Elias's father-in-law before the company acquired it through signatures no one could verify. Now Silas wanted to level it all, expand the operation, build a logging road straight through the hills where Elias had rebuilt his life in silence. And then came the whispers, the kind that curled under doors and seeped into corners. There's a girl up there now. Some say she's his daughter. No, not his. He took her from her ma, that no-good Hester. Sold the girl off like cattle, she did. She's not right, that girl. Quiet. Strange. Silas listened to it all with quiet delight. His eyes glinted at the mention of Nella, though he said nothing, just took a long sip of whiskey and nodded. That night, outside the saloon, he stood beneath the hanging lantern, lighting a cigar with a gold matchbook. One of the younger men approached him, hat in hand. She's still up there, the man said. The girl. Folks say she don't come down. But the town's soft on the old man now. Silas smiled, slow and cold. Then we remind them what kind of man Elias Mercer really is. And if the town won't push him out, we'll find another way. He dropped the match into the dust and ground it out with his heel. People forget, he muttered, staring toward the dark line of mountains beyond the town. But I don't. High above, in the hills, where Nella fed the goats and Elias chopped wood in steady rhythm, neither of them knew that the past had begun to stir again, not as memory, but as threat. And far off on the ridge, the crows watched. The snow had melted just enough to leave the road muddy, the kind that clung to wagon wheels and boots alike, and with it came things the mountain had tried to forget. Nella was on the porch, brushing the tangles from Willow the goat's fur, when she heard the crunch of hooves on gravel and the faint creak of carriage springs. She looked up. The wagon that pulled into the clearing was far too fine for a place like this. Lacquered wood, brass trim, a velvet canopy that still shone even beneath the mountain's grime. From it stepped Hester, her mother. Gone was the threadbare shawl, the cracked shoes, the face drawn tight with bitterness and want. In its place stood a woman adorned in city silks, her cheeks rouged, her hands gloved in leather, her smile practiced and false. She looked at the cabin with a sneer, not bothering to hide it. Nella stood frozen, the brush dangling useless in her hand. "Well," Hester said, eyeing her daughter up and down like inspecting a sow, "you look fatter than when I sold you." The words hit like ice water. Elias emerged from around the side of the cabin, axe still in hand, but he didn't speak. He simply stood there, massive and unmoved, the axe resting at his side, eyes locked on Hester like a tree deciding whether to fall. "I've come for the girl," she said, brushing a bit of imagined dust from her sleeve. "I hear folks in town been talking, saying there's a wild thing living with the mountain man, a little beast, like a pet bear cub. One of them traveling shows passed through, said they'd pay good coin for a sight like her. I figured, why not let her earn her keep?" Elias didn't flinch. Nella's heart pounded in her chest, too stunned to speak, too sick to move. She hadn't heard her mother's voice in weeks, and yet it came back like a venom she thought had finally drained. "She's mine," Hester said, "by blood, by law, and I'll be taking her now." Elias stepped forward then, just one pace. "No." The word was soft, low, but carried the weight of stone. Hester's eyes narrowed. "You don't get to say that. You bought her, remember? A trade's a trade. She's not yours anymore," Elias said. "Not property. Not for sale." And then, with a quickness that betrayed her venom, Hester turned on Nella. She stepped forward, grabbed the girl by the chin, and spat in her face. "You think you're better now," she hissed, "just because some broken old man feeds you soup and lets you scribble like a half-wit? You'll always be what I made you." Nella jerked back, trembling, not from fear, but something else, something stronger. She wiped her cheek with the back of her sleeve, but her eyes didn't drop this time. They stayed locked on her mother's face. "I'd rather be his nothing than your anything," she said. Hester blinked. Elias raised the axe, not threatening, not even lifting it, but the gesture was enough. "Leave," he said, and this time Hester obeyed. She turned, climbed back into her polished wagon, and with a flick of the reins, disappeared down the mountain trail without a backward glance. The wheels sprayed mud, but none of it touched Nella. Not anymore. Inside the cabin, later that night, Elias handed her a cloth and didn't ask what happened. He didn't need to, and for the first time since she'd arrived, Nella didn't feel like she had to earn her place. She already had. The letter came folded in quarters, its edges smudged with fingerprints, its seal broken. Ada brought it up the mountain herself, wrapped in oilcloth to keep out the wet. She arrived at dusk, hunched in her cloak, snow dusting her gray hair like ash. Elias saw her before she reached the porch, and when he opened the door, Nella was already behind him, sensing something was wrong from the way the trees had seemed to hold their breath all day. Ada stepped inside, shaking the cold from her sleeves. She didn't smile. She rarely did, but this time the tightness in her mouth held no warmth at all. "Read it," she said, holding out the letter like it was something foul. Elias took it with his thick, scarred hands, opened it slow, and read. His jaw clenched, his eyes darkened. Nella looked between them. "What is it?" Ada sighed and lowered herself onto the nearest stool. "It's from Grove." Not in his hand, but written on his command. A confession, supposedly penned by you, Elias, claims you kidnapped the girl, lured her from her mother, kept her in the woods like an animal. It says she cried for help, but none came. That's a lie, Nella said, her voice sharp, rising from somewhere deeper than fear. I wasn't taken. I was sold. I know, child, Ada said gently, resting a hand on her knee. And I believe you. But lies travel faster than truth in these parts. Grove has the sheriff's ear, always has. Word is he's pushing for an arrest. Says you're a danger. Says you've always been one. Elias folded the letter again. Slower this time, like each crease held back the force of what he wanted to say. He wants the land, Ada continued, and you in chains, or worse. The girl is just his way in. He thinks if the town believes you're a kidnapper, he can sweep in with legal rights and clear the ridge without a fight. He's using me, Nella whispered. Using me to ruin him. Ada nodded. You're not a girl to him. You're a tool, a stepping stone. The same way your mother saw you. The same way too many in town still might. The silence in the cabin pressed in around them, broken only by the soft crackle of the fire. Elias's face was unreadable, but his knuckles were white against the table. They'll come, he said at last, voice like worn stone. He'll send someone, with a badge or with a rope. Then we speak first, Ada said, her eyes fierce despite her years. I've started talking to folks. Real folks, not just the loud ones at the saloon. There are more people on your side than you know, but they need to hear it from her. She looked at Nella now. If you're willing. Nella hesitated, not because she was afraid to speak, but because she had never been asked, never been given the choice. But something inside her straightened then, something that had been bent her whole life. I'll tell them, she said quietly. I'll tell them what happened. Elias didn't look at her, but he reached over and placed his hand on the table near hers, not touching, just near, close enough to feel the weight of his belief. Outside, the wind rose and circled the cabin like a warning, but inside, something stronger began to gather truth, readying itself for a fight. The fire started with the smell of smoke, thin at first like a misplaced ember or a log gone bad in the stove. But when Nella sat up in bed, heart stuttering in the dark, the scent thickened, heavy and acrid, curling beneath the door. A soft crackle followed, then a pop, not from the hearth, from outside. She threw off the quilt and ran to the window. The front porch was already engulfed, flames licking the beams like hungry tongues. Shadows danced in the trees beyond, but no one was there, just black silhouettes vanishing into the woods. She turned toward Elias, who had already grabbed his coat and boots, jaw tight, eyes sharp. Out the back, he said. The heat bloomed fast. The walls moaned with it. Smoke poured down from the rafters, stinging her eyes and choking her lungs. Nella grabbed the edge of the bed, groping for the loose floorboard, her drawings, her sketches, or everything she'd made. No time, Elias said, pulling her away just as the window glass above the bed exploded from the heat. They stumbled out into the snow behind the cabin, Elias pushing her forward, shielding her with his body as the fire roared behind them. The cold bit hard at her skin, but the heat from the flames chased them like a storm. As they reached the tree line, Nella looked back. The cabin was gone, not just burning but consumed, walls collapsing, roof falling inward with a shower of sparks. Everything they'd built, everything they'd shared, her drawings, the bird carved from pine, the soft, threadbare quilt Elias had let her keep. All of it gone. And then Elias stumbled. She turned just in time to catch his weight as he dropped to one knee. Blood seeped through his shirt at the shoulder, dark and slow and awful. A splintered beam had caught him in the escape, she realized. He hadn't said a word, hadn't even slowed. "Sit down," she begged, guiding him to the snow. "You're hurt." He shook his head. "Not bad." It was. She could see that. But he stayed upright, one hand pressed to the wound, his other arm wrapped around her, keeping her close, safe. They waited there, crouched in the snow, until the flames burned lower and the black smoke drifted into the sky like morning. The next morning, the town saw the smoke, but no one came, no sheriff, no preacher. Not even the blacksmith who used to nod at Elias on supply runs. Doors stayed shut, curtains stayed drawn, fear held their tongues, same as it had when Silas Grove stole Elias's land the first time. Same as it always did. Midwife. Ada came. Hours later, her apron streaked with ash, fury in her face. She brought bandages and a blanket, helped them down the slope to her cottage. She didn't ask what had happened. She already knew. "They want to break you," she whispered as she stitched Elias's wound with steady hands. "They want to take everything so there's nothing left to fight for." Nella sat by the fire in Ada's front room, staring into the embers. They danced like the ones in her memory, only these did not burn her. These only glowed, but inside her, something else had caught flame, and this time she would not let it die. The snow had settled into slush along the edges of the town square, gray and heavy with boot tracks. Clouds hung low overhead, muting the morning light to a dull silver. The townsfolk had gathered, called by nothing official, just whispers passed from porch to porch. Something was coming, something worth seeing. And then they saw her. Nella walked slowly, the hem of her dress damp with snowmelt, boots caked in mud. Draped over her arms was Elias's coat, torn at the shoulder and stained with dried blood. She wore no hat, no shawl, no attempt to look respectable. Her hair blew loose around her face, and though her hands trembled, she didn't hide them. The murmurs began. That the Mercer girl? No, the one he stole. Didn't she run off with him? She's the one from the fire, ain't she? She stepped up onto the old stone well in the center of the square, her knees weak beneath her. The coat felt heavy, not just with blood, but with the weight of the truth it carried. Her throat was dry, her legs wobbled, but she did not climb down. She looked out at the faces, some familiar, some strangers, all wary. "My name is Nella," she said, voice barely more than a whisper. "Some of you think you know who I am. You don't." Silence settled. "My mother sold me," she continued, louder this time, "traded me to a man she called a beast. Not because he hurt people, but because he wouldn't bow to those who did." A few gasps, a few narrowed eyes. "She gave me to Elias Mercer for a mule and a sack of oats. Not because she couldn't feed me, but because I was nothing to her. I wasn't pretty enough. I wasn't useful. I was an embarrassment." She held up the coat, bloodied, torn, still smelling of smoke and pine. "This man, this so-called monster you've all whispered about, he gave me a bed when no one else would give me a kind word. He gave me silence instead of cruelty, safety instead of shame. And last night he nearly died pulling me from a fire someone set to run us off that mountain." She scanned their faces, eyes sharp now, cutting through the fog of their hesitation. "You know who did it. Or you've guessed. Silas Grove wants the land, just like he always has. He's trying to finish what he started when he killed Elias's wife and daughter. With his reckless blasting, he'll do anything to take what isn't his, including using me as bait." A beat passed. The square was breathless. "I'm not a freak. I'm not a thief. I'm not some cursed girl who needed rescuing. I was thrown away, and I found a man broken enough to understand what that feels like. We saved each other. The trembling stopped. Her shoulders squared. I came down this mountain not to beg, not to plead, but to tell the truth. And what you do with that truth, how you choose to look at him and me and yourselves, will say everything about what kind of town this really is. No applause followed. No cheers. Just silence. But not the kind that dismissed her. It was the kind that listened. She stepped down from the well, the coat still clutched to her chest, and walked past the crowd that parted without a word. Behind her, one woman cleared her throat, then a man removed his hat. And somewhere near the edge of the square, midwife Ada crossed her arms and smiled, not with pride, but with relief. The girl had stood, and the town for once had not turned away. For a moment, after Nella stepped down, the town square held its breath. The cold hung heavy in the air, and even the crows in the steeple above were still. Then came the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps, boots striking stone. All eyes turned as midwife Ada walked to the center, her chin held high and her voice steady. "She's telling the truth," Ada said. "And if any of you had half the courage that girl just showed, you'd be standing beside her already." A few in the crowd shifted uneasily. Ada didn't blink. "I was there the day Rachel Mercer gave birth to their little girl. I saw the joy in Elias's eyes when he held his child, and I saw what that mind did to them. I saw what Silas Grove called an accident, the fire, the rubble, the grief that never let that man speak more than a few words since." Someone coughed. Someone else looked down at their boots. "You all blamed him," Ada continued, "and said he brought the fire. That he must have done something wrong, because it was easier to blame a quiet man than a rich one. You let Silas pay a fine and go back to his big house while Elias buried 2 people with his bare hands." The silence cracked a little. Then a deep, gravelly voice rose from the edge of the crowd. "I remember that fire," said the old blacksmith, a man named Harrow, whose arms were still thick with muscle even in age. He stepped forward, rubbing soot-stained fingers against his apron. "I helped drag timber off the house when we tried to get inside. I saw what was left, and I saw Silas laugh at the funeral." Gasps rippled. Harrow turned to look at Nella. "Elias didn't take that girl. He saved her. And he did it with the same hands he used to build half the homes in this valley before the world turned its back on him." A woman stepped out next, Miss Riling, the school teacher, her skirts trailing frost and chalk, still dusting her sleeves. "I taught Nella when she was small," she said. "No one sat beside her. No one invited her to games, but she still left drawings under my desk. Flowers, birds, little notes that said, 'Thank you.' She was kind, even when we weren't." A murmur spread through the crowd, low but growing. "I heard she was sold," said the grocer's wife. "That ain't right," someone else muttered. "A child ain't livestock." "He kept her safe," another voice added. "Built her up when she could have broken." Voices overlapped now, not whispering, not gossiping, but speaking truth, pushing back against the silence that had protected the wrong people for too long. The weight shifted. The stories people had believed are the ones about the monster in the hills, the cursed girl, the reclusive brute, fell apart like wet paper. They weren't looking at a beast anymore. They were looking at a man who had lost everything and still found the strength to protect someone else. And they were looking at the girl who reminded them what it meant to care again. Nella stood quietly near the edge of the crowd, Elias's bloodied coat still clutched to her chest. She didn't speak again. She didn't need to, because now, finally, they were speaking for her. The church bell rang, slow and steady, calling not for worship, but for reckoning. Snow clung to the boots of every soul who made their way up the hill, to the whitewashed chapel, its steeple cutting through the gray sky like a warning. The benches inside filled quickly. Old men who had built their homes from the ridge timber, mothers holding infants close, schoolchildren too young to understand the weight of what was coming. And near the front, the sheriff stood with his hat in his hands, flanked by Silas Grove, dressed in a fine wool coat that seemed too smooth for the mountains he wanted to gut. Then the door creaked open. Elias stepped through, limping, one arm bound in a sling, the other resting heavily on a carved walking stick. His face bore the same quiet it always had, but his eyes burned steady. Beside him walked Nella, chin high, her small frame dwarfed by the old coat she wore like armor. The crowd parted for them. No one dared stop them now. Silas turned with a smirk already on his lips. "Took you long enough," he said, loud enough for the pews to hear. "You planning to confess? Or are we dragging this out with more tall tales and pity plays?" Elias said nothing. He simply stepped forward until he stood near the pulpit. Nella followed, then handed him something wrapped in cloth. He unwrapped it carefully, the old fabric falling away to reveal a charred Bible, edges singed, leather cracked, but still intact. From its center, he pulled a folded piece of parchment, yellowed and brittle with time. "This," Elias said, voice low but clear, "is the original land deed to the North Ridge, signed by Rachel's father and witnessed by two men, one of them the town clerk, the other your own father, Grove." The room shifted. "You said the deed was lost in the fire," the sheriff said, stepping forward, confused. "It was," Elias replied. "I found it last week. In the wreckage after the cabin burned. It had been tucked inside Rachel's Bible, hidden." "Probably forged," Silas scoffed, but his voice cracked. "It's not," Ada said from her place in the front pew. "That's my signature on the ribbon corner. I was there the day Rachel received it. She asked me to witness it." Silas's jaw clenched. "So what? The girl's not yours. You still kept her." "She was sold," Ada snapped. "And you, Silas, have spent decades taking what didn't belong to you. That fire didn't just take a family, it cleared the way for your saws, and now you tried again." The sheriff turned toward Silas, face pale. "Is that true? Did you have men set that fire?" Silas didn't answer. The room turned hard with silence. "You always said he was the danger," Harrow, the blacksmith, growled from the back. "But it was you we should have feared." Someone stood. Then another. A voice called out, "Arrest him!" "Justice," came another. The sheriff hesitated only a second more before stepping toward Silas, slipping the iron cuffs from his belt. Silas backed away, eyes darting. "You don't know what you're doing," he hissed. "This town needs men like me. You'll be begging for my money come winter." "No," Nella said softly from behind Elias. "We won't." The cuffs clicked shut, and for the first time in years, the town stood not in fear but in truth. The church held no sermon that day, only silence, broken by the sound of a man finally being held accountable and the steady breath of those who had waited far too long to be heard. They led Silas Grove out of the church in shackles, his face pale with rage, not fear. He snarled at anyone who looked him in the eye, but the townspeople no longer flinched. No one lowered their gaze. They watched him pass like a bad dream, finally fading in the morning light. The sheriff said little as he loaded him onto the wagon bound for the county jail. Perhaps he too had seen the truth too late, or perhaps he had always known and lacked the courage to act. Either way, justice had found its way up the mountain at last. By sundown, the mood in town had changed. The fear that once clung to the alleys and porches had lifted, leaving behind a kind of shame, an uneasy realization that they'd stood by while a good man was buried in silence and a child was sold like cattle. But it wasn't just Grove the town turned its eyes on. It was Hester. She returned the next morning, unaware of what had taken place in the church. Her polished shoes clicked against the boardwalk as she strolled into the general store, chin held high, pretending she hadn't sold her daughter to a man she'd called a monster. But the storekeeper refused to serve her. When she tried the dressmaker, the door was locked. Outside the saloon, a group of women turned their backs to her. She spat curses under her breath, called them all hypocrites, cowards, liars. But when midwife Ada approached, silent, arms folded, eyes hard, Hester fell quiet. She muttered something about a mistake and just trying to survive, but no one listened. No one defended her. By sundown, her rented room was cleared out, her wagon loaded with what little she'd earned from her schemes. And when she rode out of town, no one waved. At the edge of town, Nella stood on the rise with Elias beside her. They watched Hester pass without a word. The woman didn't look up. She didn't dare. "I thought I'd feel something," Nella whispered. Anger. Relief. Something Elias didn't answer, but she didn't need him to. Later that week, the town council called a meeting. It was held in the same church where truth had finally been spoken. They offered Elias money, compensation for the land Grove had tried to steal, for the suffering he'd endured, for the years lost. But Elias shook his head. "I don't want your gold," he said, voice steady. "I want land. Just enough to build again, not to take from the mountain, but to teach others how to live with it. There's a better way." At first, they didn't understand, but Ada stood beside him, then Harrow, then the schoolteacher, and slowly, heads nodded. Within a week, Elias was granted title to a new plot at the base of the ridge, a fertile stretch of land untouched by mining. It wasn't large, but it was enough. Elias and Nella returned to the mountains not as outcasts, but as something else, something the town still struggled to name. Not heroes, not saints, but the ones who endured. And now they would rebuild, not just walls and roofs, but something deeper, something rooted in truth, in silence, in the soil. Spring came late that year, but it came all the same. The snow melted slowly, feeding the roots beneath the earth and soaking the edges of the trail that led up to the new plot at the base of the ridge. Where charred ground and ruin once stood, now there was sawdust, laughter, and the ring of hammers against fresh timber. The air smelled of cedar and hope. Elias worked beside the others, slower now with his healing arm, but steady as ever. The blacksmith brought nails and tools. The schoolteacher's husband cut logs from his own land. Even the quiet widow who ran the bakery brought bread every day, her eyes soft with apologies she never quite voiced. No one said much about the past. They simply showed up and built. And Nella was always near, sleeves rolled, hands calloused, boots caked in earth. She helped raise the walls beam by beam, her eyes bright beneath the brim of her hat. She didn't flinch when someone touched her shoulder, didn't lower her eyes when children watched her walk by. If they stared at her crooked smile or her uneven features, she only smiled wider. The new cabin rose in less than a month, stronger than the first, with windows that opened to let in the wind, and a porch wide enough to sit on during quiet evenings. But this time, it wasn't just a home, it was something more. They built a second room beside the main living space, smaller but bright, with shelves and benches and a worn rug beneath the table. That room became the school, not for numbers or scripture, though Nella taught those too, but for something gentler. She called it Drawing What You Feel, though the sign they nailed to the front porch simply read, For the Quiet Ones. Children who had once been pushed to the edges of the classroom, the ones too strange or too scarred or too slow, found their way of the trail. Some had birthmarks, twisted limbs, speech that stuttered. Some just had heavy hearts. Nella welcomed them all. They painted with berries and ash, sketched with charcoal and coal. She taught them to see themselves in the trees, in the crooked lines of river rocks, in the soft curve of a goat's ear. She hung their work proudly on the cabin walls alongside her own. The animals she once hid beneath the bed now stood framed in simple wood. Birds mid-flight, a fox curled in sleep, a girl smiling through tears. One afternoon, while the children rested beneath the pines, Elias carved at a block of walnut beside the fire. He worked slowly, his hand sure, the blade shaping something with care. Nella watched without speaking, only smiling as the corners smoothed, the details emerged. When he was done, he placed it in her hands, a picture frame. She knew before she looked that it was the same size as the one that had burned in the fire. But this one bore carved edges, tiny vines, pine cones, and at the top, a bird in flight. For a long time, she held it against her chest. Later, she slipped a new drawing inside, her latest work, a girl and a man, both marked by time, both rough around the edges, but smiling, not because everything was perfect, but because they had survived and now they were home. The garden grew like it had always been there, like the mountain itself had been waiting for the right hands to wake it. No neat rows, no tidy fences, just color and life spilling in every direction. Wildflowers tangled with herbs, vines crept along the stone path, and tall sunbursts of goldenrod swayed beside soft clumps of lavender and wild mint. Bees hummed through the air. The soil, once hardened by ash and grief, now cradled roots that reached deep and wide. Outside the cabin, under the gentle warmth of a mid-spring sun, Elias sat on a low wooden bench he'd carved himself. A straw hat shaded his eyes, though he rarely looked away from the little group scattered on blankets near the garden's edge. His beard had grown longer, his limp more pronounced on rainy days, but his face held a peace that softened even the deepest of its lines. Nella knelt in the grass, her skirts gathered, a charcoal pencil smudged between her fingers. Around her, 4 children leaned over their own sketch cloths, tongues between their teeth, brows furrowed with concentration. A boy with one arm traced the curve of a dandelion. A girl with burn scars shaded the petals of a violet. No one rushed. No one fretted. The only sound was laughter and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. "Don't worry about getting it right," Nella said gently. "Flowers don't worry about being perfect. They just grow." One of the younger girls, barely 6, looked up with wide eyes. "Even if they're crooked?" Nella smiled, especially then. Behind her, the cabin windows glinted in the sunlight. Inside, drawings hung from string and frame, portraits of goats, pine trees, and hands holding hands. On the doorframe, a new carving had been added. "Welcome, wild things." It wasn't just the name of the school anymore. It was what they all called the place now. The children, the townsfolk who came by to trade seeds or sit a while, the travelers who passed through just to see what hope looked like. Elias leaned back, breathing in the air thick with pine and thyme and soil. For the first time in years, he didn't think of what he'd lost. He thought of what had grown in its place, slowly, painfully, honestly. Nella looked over his shoulder, caught his gaze, and for a moment neither of them had to speak. They never really did. Their quiet had become a language all its own. As the sun dipped lower, casting golden light across the wild blossoms, a breeze stirred through the trees, soft and fragrant. The crows circled above, not as omens, but as guardians. The children giggled as their drawings fluttered in the wind. And in the hush of that perfect moment, the world seemed to pause, just long enough to understand. They called her ugly, but love sees true, and what was broken now blooms,